much better than me.
Okay, I can do that. First I want to say, about a month ago, Adam reached out to me and asked if, he said I think Kyle and some others had followed the Hostess Brands experience and talked about the conference and asked if I could come speak and gave me the dates. And I said, let me check and try to work that out. And it also happened to be the same week that my family's moving from one city to another. So my wife is very displeased with all of you, and I'm forever indebted. So when I say I'm really happy to be here, I mean I'm really happy to be here. The time difference works out well also because there's very limited communication. Although I did tell someone the other day, I said, I'm going to be a day ahead of you, so if you'd like to know the future, just let me know and I'll fill you in. A little background, I've spent the last 30 years working in, I guess, what I'll loosely call the restructuring industry in a variety of capacities. I was a partner at Arthur Andersen at the early part of my career, left there to go run companies. I did it through a couple of boutique shops. J. Allens and Associates was one, FTI Consulting was one, then I went on my own 4 years ago. So I've spent probably the last, I'd say 10 to 15 years as what I would call a fix-it guy. So companies in relative levels of dysfunction all the way to crisis and full-blown crisis would ask me to come in some position of leadership, typically CEO. They generally take me about 1.5 to 2 years at a time to resolve, and I sort of go from one to the other. I'm not an industry specialist, so I've done every industry you can imagine. I did WorldCom when they were in their bankruptcy, which was the largest bankruptcy ever at the time in the States. That was telecom. I did Muzak. I was the CEO of Muzak. I was the CEO of Centerra Corporation. We had 89 resorts in 8 countries, so it's kind of been all over the map. Each job is different in terms of what my role ends up being. Hostess was certainly that. So Hostess Brands, for those of you who don't know, which is probably most of you, can you hear me all right, by the way? Yeah. Hostess Brands, $2.5 billion in sales, 80-year-old company, a roll-up, so a lot of acquisitions over a lot of years. By the time I got there, 18,500 employees, all U.S. domestic, 36 plants, and of the 18,500 employees, all but 2,000 union. And we had 11 unions. We had 364 different collective bargaining agreements, CBAs. So when I say CBAs, that's what I mean. It may be a different term here. Quite a mess, as you can imagine. The company was negotiating the 2 largest unions, and this is really a tale of 2 unions. So when we talk about hard lessons learned, you're going to see a dichotomy between how the 2 largest unions chose to deal with this and what the aftermath of that was. The largest union were Teamsters. So I had about 7,000 members of my Teamsters, which were typically our drivers. About the next largest was the bakers, so the guys in the plants. That was about 4,500. So you can see of those 2, that the majority of my employee base was resident of those 2 unions. As I mentioned, we had several others, smaller. Before I ever got there, and before the company filed for bankruptcy, it spent a year negotiating with the Teamsters. The Bakers Union had early on basically said, look, we don't want to engage, and there's reasons for that, which actually makes sense. We don't want to engage. You get a deal done. If you get something with the Teamsters, then come talk to us, which unfortunately led the multitude of professionals and lawyers and management team to think that whatever the Teamsters would agree to, because they are typically the most difficult union to negotiate with in the States, the bakers would live with and life would go on. So they spent a year out of court getting nowhere. So they ultimately said, okay, well, we need to file for bankruptcy. We need to try to use the various provisions of the U.S. Bankruptcy Code as a hammer, and there are various methods you can use to sort of try to beat down the unions. And anyway, a lot of the strategy that was being planned by the professionals and the management was poor strategy, but they filed. About 2 months into the filing, I got a call to come in, and that led to my being placed as CEO about, 3 months after the initial filing. And I got involved in the negotiations, so this would have been around around April 2 years ago. The big issues with the Teamsters, well, I'll start with work rules. So apparently you have, according to Teresa, some fabulous work rules embedded in your system. Well, we did too. So Hostess, of that $2.5 billion of sales, was divided into two big groups, cake and bread. So you had bread side, you had Wonder Bread, Merita, you had 15 different brands of well-known bread brands. And on the cake side, you had Twinkies, Ding Dongs, Ho-Hos, and Drake's Cakes, and all that stuff, right? My informal title was Head Ding Dong. So we had work rules basically that would say that someone in a certain union had to handle the bread deliveries to the same retailer, but they couldn't do the cake deliveries, so a different guy in a different truck had to come to the same retailer and bring the cake. And then neither of those two guys could come in and do any kind of fulfillment in-store. They had to be a different union to come in and do fulfillment. So there you go. We didn't have snappy titles for them like Teresa. Those were some good ones. But so we had work rules that were a mess. The bigger issues were also pension issues, unfunded pension liability, potential mass withdrawal liability. I don't know how much in Australia the pension and legacy cost issue is an issue here. I can tell you in the States the healthcare costs were an issue as well, but they are not really unique to unions. So from a union to non-union standpoint, every employer in the States is trying to push off healthcare costs back down to the employee base. So that wasn't as big a problem for us, but the pension issues were a huge problem. And that was a stumbling block in negotiations so far. And what that did, though, was it also illustrated pretty clearly the difficulty of attracting capital with that kind of collective bargaining agreement and pension liability atmosphere. It's basically toxic. So there are, and when I say professional, I mean we had the best out of New York, some of the top attorneys and the top investment bankers and everyone you can imagine spending a year trying to find outside capital to come in and solve the problems of this business, assuming that I could get an agreement with the unions and push it through. That process yielded commitments for new capital of exactly zero. So, you know, capital, and what you're seeing here from what I heard earlier with companies moving elsewhere, you know, capital is like water in a stream. It's going to move as fast as it needs to, around whatever rocks it needs to. You're going to, you know, it's going to solve its own problems, whether you choose to solve them structurally or not. I was on, I don't know, it's about a month ago. I don't know if you follow the Donald Sterling, LA Clippers, the racist comments and all the stuff with the NBA. I was being interviewed on Bloomberg television that morning, and it was before the NBA announced their punishment, and the anchor asked me, you know, what do you think the NBA should do, and how should they resolve this issue? And I said, it doesn't matter what they do. The market will resolve the issue. Capital will resolve the issue. And she said, what do you mean? And I said, well, look, yesterday all their sponsors left. All of them. All of them. Think about that. I don't care how rich you are. You know, if you're an owner of a team and you have no sponsor money, and then it gets to the level where nobody's going to buy tickets, you know, the capital market will decide whether you have to sell or not. You know, they went on to ban him. They're going to try to fight it. They have a very weak case in terms of forcing him to sell the team. But, you know, that's not regardless to the moral issues. The guy's a lunatic. They said, Greg, if you were there, if you were a fix-it guy, how would you fix it? I said, well, we have a saying in the South, you can't fix stupid. So, I have no fix for Mr. Sterling. But the ultimate sale or non-sale will be dependent on capital. It's the same issue with us at Hostess. It's the same issue with you here. And we could talk a little on the panel. We should talk about Texas and how Texas, as an individual state, has chosen to deal with that from a structural, legislative, and other basis, because they are one that's actually doing it right and attracting capital and attracting investment. So we got no outside interest. That meant that my existing lenders, hedge funds primarily, were captive. They were my captive finance. So now I'm in a situation where I've got to solve their problem, I've got to solve the Teamsters problem, and I've got to solve the company's problem. So it's a three-way negotiation. And over 3 months, I got that done. It became an issue, though, and this is the real interesting part to me. I would sit at this table and I would hear the Teamsters guys say, well, we're not afraid to liquidate. We're not, you know, we're not afraid to walk, we're not afraid to strike. And I would hear the finance guys say, well, we're not afraid for you to do that either, right? After about a month of that, I realized that that was bullshit. They were scared shitless of being the one that got the tail of the donkey pinned on them for causing the collapse and the loss of jobs. It's a PR issue as much as anything else. It's an investor issue. It's a problem, right? So I had let them control the shot clock in the game up until that point. And at that point, I took the shot clock over. Because our conditions were deteriorating, so you can't just put a company in bankruptcy, even though it's well-known brands, and expect that there's no deterioration in the underlying business. Because in that state, every account I lost, I had no ability to go and replace it, right? So I can't get new work. So the churn eats into that sales base, eats into the profitability. It makes your wage concessions number keep going up. Your pension concessions number keep going up. It just gets harder over time. So after a few months, I said, well, I'm taking the shot clock. And the only way I could do that was I called both the Teamsters leadership and I called the lenders, and I said, you know, I'm going to call a board meeting and I'm going to shut the company down because it's not tenable anymore, right? I mean, my job, and you know, there's a fiduciary responsibility in the U.S. court system, federal bankruptcies, federal court. My job is to, at the end of the day, maximize the recovery to whatever the stakeholders are, wherever they are in the capital stack. And I was at a point where I could demonstrate to them that continuing to go on and waiting for them to come to their senses was going to diminish what I might get next week or tomorrow or a month from now in a liquidation. So by taking the shot clock, it forced agreement. The agreement was not all that complicated. We solved the pension issues. I was asking for an 8% wage concession, but I asked for it across the board, all employees, including management. So my point was, you know, look, management, someone asked earlier, I think it was, you know, what are the companies doing? I think it was your question. You know, don't the companies have some responsibility? Every time I go into these situations, this is not the first one I've done with labor, I end up always having to point out to the company itself and the board and the investors and the lenders that every CBA that I've ever seen has 2 signatures on it. So I don't really have a lot of time for you to sit there and tell me how shitty this deal is, right? You signed it, right? You have a responsibility. Management has a responsibility to, you know, do what's in the best interest, not just to sign stuff and then pass it and move it along and then gripe about it for 3 years and say, well, I'll get on the next time. You know, it doesn't work that way. It doesn't work well that way. So we go through the process, we get that done, and the Teamsters, to their credit, and I will tell you, here's the dichotomy. So Teamsters are highly organized, highly professional at the international leadership level in Washington. Jimmy Hoffs Jr. is the head. Ken Hall is his right-hand guy. Ken's the guy I dealt with. They are tough negotiators, there's no question. Probably the toughest I've ever seen. But they are consistent, and they are organized, and they don't sit there with a 100-year-old playbook and, you know, and you're in a crisis and they're worried about, you know, process. So we got there. We got where we needed to go. And they agreed. They said, look, this is a really bad deal for our employees. And so what I told them was, I said, look, if you don't pass it, we're shutting it down. So everyone's out of work. That's the deal. And they said, well, look, we will let our membership decide in a vote. And we won't color it either way. We will tell them we think obviously it's a bad deal in historical terms, but we'll let them vote because, you know, their job will depend on it. And they did just that. They put together a 45-minute video. I saw the video. They didn't consult me on it, but I saw it. It was very fair and balanced. It laid out exactly what we needed and why. It laid out what the difficulties would be, what the risks were both to the company and to them. And it passed. Not by a ton. That was a long day. I think we got 54% of the vote, of those voting. But it passed. So then we moved to the Bakers Union. In contrast, the Bakers leadership was, I would say, I don't mean unprofessional in the derogatory sense you might take that, but not as polished, not as consistent, not also with the same degree of control over the various locals that the Teamsters seem to have in terms of influence. And we sat down and we went through it. We said, look, we did what you wanted. We got the deal with the Teamsters. Here's what the deal is. It has to be the same deal for you. It can't be different. Right? 8% pay cut for everybody includes management. I'm not going to make your deal different. If I make your deal different, then I don't have a deal with the Teamsters anymore, and we're just wasting our time. And they thought about it for a week, and then they came back and they said, look, we will put it out for a vote, and we'll let our membership decide. Same thing the Teamsters said. And then within a day, the leader of that union put out a note, and it had a sentence in it that said, I would never sign this piece of crap. And then they started an active lobbying at the local plant level against passing this. Very active. Both, PR on site, taking the 8% and arguing that that's in reality a 27% cut somehow with all kind of strange math. And I then had to go on I and my management team had to go on a road show, and I asked for the most difficult plants, the historically most difficult plants, and I went to many of those and tried to appeal, to the members. We used television quite a bit to try to appeal. That was frankly, my strategy was to try to appeal to the members' spouses. So I would spend days where you do these satellite things, but it was all local TV. So I would try to go to every local market where we had a plant, because my point was, it's one thing for you to tell me, your leader, to get you wound up and say, well, I'm just quitting, I'm walking, I'm striking. But the spouse says, really? You're not gonna have a paycheck? I mean, what are you doing? So we tried everything we could, but they rallied the troops and went on strike. We tried to man, the plants where we could, but after about a week, the business was already fragile, as you can imagine. I got to the point where I had to give them an ultimatum. I had to say, you have until tomorrow at 5 o'clock. That was like a Thursday. I think I sent it out on Wednesday, and I said, and I was doing tons of national media too, so it was all over the place. And I said, you got till 5 o'clock. If you don't come back in any significant numbers across the picket lines and get back to work, then I'm going to close it. They didn't. So I called Thursday, I got my board together, and I said, we're shutting it down. And I told the lenders, and I told the Teamsters, and it's interesting because the very next morning, the Today Show calls, and they want to have me on. And it's the shortest interview I think I've ever done on television, because it was Guthrie, whatever her name is, and she says, well, isn't this just after the preliminary intro, isn't this just a bargaining tactic by you to try to get them to the table? And I said, no, we're done. We're just done. And that was it. Very short. So here's the interesting thing about that from a capital and from a recovery standpoint, so the end of that story, and then I'll let you guys ask whatever questions you want. My captive lenders were willing to finance this exit, right, with the concessions that I needed to achieve with the unions. They were willing to do that as opposed to just kill it, right, and take their money in liquidation. And that's fine. So the investment bankers looked at that plan, and the inherent or the expected enterprise value of that business and the value, therefore, to the lenders was about $400 million. Okay, lots of assumptions go into that. That could be wrong or whatever. But essentially, they were walking away, writing off debt, reinstituting an infusion of capital. I had a turnaround plan. I had all this other fancy stuff, so we were going to roll with that, right? But what they were going to get was worth about $400 million. At the point in time that we shut it, we were then out from under all of the contracts. There's a lot of legalese around that, but I was free to sell the brands, right, in a process. So now I'm selling, as opposed to the year before where I'm selling with, the structure I had, now I'm selling the brands free and clear. So as of last week, we generated $1 billion in recovery in the sales of those brands. And those brands are all back on the market, non-union. So the job loss, the decision by leadership within one union of 4,500 people, put 18,500 people out of work, very few of which are working now at Hostess, whatever Newco Hostess is. It's actually two different companies, because we sold the bread to one and the cakes to another. But that $1 billion has paid off all the debt. We're now paying off something called fourth lien debt, which I've never heard of fourth lien debt in my life. I don't know if you've ever seen that here, but I call that equity. But there's now recoveries against that, right? So, that's more than double what the lenders were willing to sign up for to keep this thing going. And I think there's another hard lesson, and I'll close with this. And it's something that was, the first time I ever saw it in a labor situation, it struck me as odd and counterintuitive. Because in the past I thought that the toughest thing to do probably in labor negotiation was a headcount reduction. And the hardest thing I would think for leadership to push through would be, we have to get rid of a sizable portion of our workforce. And it really doesn't end up working that way. I have a theory as to why, and I could be wrong, but I don't think I am. Take the Bakers Union, for example, 4,500 people. If I had gone to them and said, I need to get rid of 2,000 of your members, almost half, to solve my problem with the business, but I'm not going to touch the pay of the ones who stay, they probably would have said okay. As opposed to saying, I need 4,500 people to take an 8% reduction. And you think, why? Well, I've heard people say that the reason why is that people who get fired and are gone don't vote for leadership the next time the elections come around.
That's real.
And that's why.
Just say that again.
People who are fired aren't voting for union leadership the next time the elections are held.
Right.
So what you do to the people who remain is more important than how many people you get rid of.
Right.
And with that, I'll close. For Hard Lessons from Hostess, I'm happy to take whatever questions you have as a group.
Greg, Richard Colbeck, you discussed it pretty quickly, getting rid of the pension problem. Could you explain how you achieved that?
Yeah, this may be a unique situation, and I can't profess to know much about the way pensions are dealt with here. We had on the Teamster side a number of what I call MEPs, multi-employer pension plans. Okay, so those are designed with a number of various employers contributing into that for the benefit of the membership, the union membership across various companies. All of those in the past 15 years, they are rated in terms of their ability to pay green, yellow, and red, in terms of how funded they are or unfunded they are. All of them are moving to red because companies are failing under the weight of whatever the issues are within their payment schemes, their health care, their ability to compete. And as companies fail and drop out of those plans and are unable to contribute, that then puts more burden on the rest of the employers, right? And then the risk then is of something called mass withdrawal liability, which can come back around and get attached to a company that left, even though it's out, right? So with the bind that I was in was that my lenders were saying no MEPs, no MEPs, no MEPs, and the Teamsters were saying there's no way we're doing a deal ever without the MEPs. This is going to sound really stupid to you, but my solution to that was, I said, okay, fine. I had to get the lenders to say we will stay in the MEPs, okay, but we'll have exit rights. So we came up with a stream of ways to deal with the economic risks. So my point to the lenders was, look, what economic risk are you worried about? Mass withdrawal? Fine. If it gets from green to yellow, we're out. Before it ever gets to red, before it ever has the years to attach you as a liability, right? There were a number of other risks as well. So it wasn't as simple as one thing, but we came up with a list that basically gave both sides what they needed, which is protect my economic risk as a lender, right, and my potential returns, but give the Teamsters something that they need that doesn't look like we're just abandoning and creating a problem for the residual.